Thank you, Mary. That genius part comes as a surprise to me. I'll take it for now.
I told
Until
her
you just spell it.
I told her to say that.
Okay, well, thank you. Your money's on the way. So, hot off the presses, and hopefully this won't take a great deal of time. But as Mary mentioned, I have a budding and growing interest in the area of neurocognition and music. And I've been kind of reading stuff over the past few months. I talked about this earlier in the earlier presentation that I did. And I'm starting to kind of look more at how does the information that's starting to well up in neurocognition, how does it inform what we do, or how might it inform what we do as songwriters? So, it's my presentation. And I call it Songwriters Brings the Science Behind the Craft of Songwriting. As I started to kind of look at it, I realized there's a whole bunch of stuff, too much stuff to pack into maybe 20 or 30 minutes. So I had to kind of narrow this down. So hopefully I narrowed it down enough. But basically, I don't want to give a neurological lesson on basic neural structures and stuff like that, but only to say that a lot of what we do as far as songwriters, a lot of the communication ability that we have is by virtue of a kind of a sympathical relationship between our brains and the brains of the audience. There's structures in the brain of the audience that we get to kind of tickle, we get to kind of arouse with our craft and with our ability that kind of causes little lights to kind of flash in and on and off in their brains that puts in them similar ideation and imagery and feelings that we're trying to express when we're successful. And I think that looking at some of the research and some of the findings and speculations in neurocognition will give us more tools towards moving in the directions of being successful at that. It's not to demystify the songwriting process, but in a lot of the advice that we get about how to get better, I think that could be aided by some of the specific types of things that come out of neuroscience in terms of exactly what should we be doing that might, in our activities, move us closer to that goal of being able to take the emotional imagery, thoughts, and feelings that we have and awaken those same things in an audience. So in putting this together, one of the first things I wanted to kind of debate was, why are we musical in the first place? It just kind of seems like, well, maybe it's just this kind of natural thing, or the birds and the bees are natural, we're just natural, we're hard. It's usually a little bit more complicated than that. And Darwin kind of proposed that we had a kind of a musical proto-language even before we were verbal. That even before we were verbal, we were musical. And it's a history or a genetic heritage that we share with a number of different animals. If you look at the animals across various species, they communicate in a verbal, but they certainly make vocalizations, cries, rhythmic types of signals and posturing that give you a sense of what they have on their mind. Low growls to indicate, anger and aggression. High-pitched squeals that indicate a kind of fear or maybe even happiness in some regards. And Darwin speculated that before we were verbal, we had those types of communications amongst ourselves. And by and large, that's been kind of substantiated. He has some other kind of twists and turns on that basic idea that didn't quite hold up. But that basic idea that we were probably musical before we were verbal seems to be kind of standing up. And when kind of ethnomusicologists, biologists, and the like take a look at this idea, they look at some of the key functions of music in early humans. And of course, it's going to be kind of something that's passed along genetically, has some sort of a survival value. There'd be something about the music that biased, say, the musicians or those musically inclined to survival over those who weren't so musically inclined. And one of the prevailing ideas is that music bound people together in the social needs. It allowed them to share, coordinate their emotionality, their goals, and their interests. And that something about cooperation biased you in terms of survival over humans that weren't predisposed to that type of cooperation. And I can roll that forward to a recent study where they looked at little kids. And what they did was they taught one group of little kids a little drumming exercise. And they played around and did this little drumming exercise and playing. Took another little group of kids and they gave them something as fun to do. They didn't have the drumming and the musical coordination as the kids that did the drumming had. And then just another control group of kids just did whatever. Subsequent to that, what they did was they put the kids in a room where they could play with these toys, just uninterrupted by adults, just kind of on their own. The games they had to play, there was a tube. The tube had little balls in it, and what they would need to do was each kid would have to get a tube of balls and take them over to this other apparatus where they would use the balls on the thing to play the little game. Tubes were rigged. On the bottom of one of the tubes, it was loose, and when you tried to carry the tube across, the balls would fall out. So they would put two kids in the room with the toys, right? And the kids would get the stuff to go across the room, and one kid's ball would fall out. No pun intended. And what they found was that the kids who engaged in the rhythmic kind of communal activity of making music together, when they noticed that the kids' balls had fallen out, they stopped whatever they were doing, they stopped their play, and they helped. More so than the kids who were just taught some other fun activity but did not involve the musical kind of coming together, the drumming exercise. And so comparing the kids who had been involved in music to the kids who had been involved in other activities that didn't involve music, and to the kids who just left on their own, the kids that had been involved in music were more empathetic and more willing to join and help the person that was, they were more attuned to the distress of that person and to help that kid. So, kind of rolling that idea that there was something about music that joined us together and made us want to help one another, and that biased us towards survival beyond those who didn't have that predisposition. You kind of can see that in some of that line of research. So the idea that music may have promoted social bonding that kind of got us, it also kind of made our brains interested in being in synchronized activities with others. Another part of that is the idea that the competencies that we use to generate music are really kind of geared into the same pleasure centers as other things that contribute to our survival. So our ability to discern different pitches and in a noisy environment or in an environment of a number of different things going on, to discern the difference between one pitch and another, and if this came from one instrument and not this other instrument, relates to how important that might have been in a hostile environment in the dark, where it was important for you to understand what was going out beyond your vision, right? And things that kind of contributed to our survival, it kind of linked in with our dopamine centers and our pleasure centers. And whenever we're engaged in something that's related kind of genetically or evolutionarily to our survival, we get this little ping of pleasure from it. And music provides us a lot of those pings of pleasure. And it turns out that music, in terms of the competencies that it leverages, is related to a lot of things that would have been key to our survival. A lot of those things aren't necessarily key to our survival now, but implicitly, deep down in the ancient parts of our brains, those linkages still are there. So when they're pinged, we still feel the pleasure of having, in a sense, having saved ourselves. And so then, again, we kind of think of music as being something that we kind of get from the birds and other animals. But it turns out that we are unique amongst musical species. Just as we are unique in terms of our ability to communicate by language, we are unique in our musical ability. We think of songbirds as being the kind of epitome of musical expression. It turns out they are not nearly as adept at music as we are. One of the things that they are unable to do, we are able to do, is transpose pitch.
Same song all the time. They have to sing the same song.
They have to sing the same song all the time. And you can teach them a song within certain limits of that, but if you get beyond a certain limit, they won't recognize it as being the same song. Whereas with us, as long as the relative distance between the pitches is right, we're going to recognize it as being the same song no matter what key you put it in or how high or how low you play it.
So they have perfect pitch and we don't.
But they can't change pitches.
Well, they can't pick, well,
They
it
can't
depends on your
change
conception of
pitches.
perfect pitch. Perfect pitch is another issue that I'm not going to get, but it has to do with some neurological linkages that most of us don't end up having. Yes?
What about a mockingbird?
They have a lot of repertoire.
They have a lot of repertoire, and
They come back from every year when they come back from the north to the south, they bring sounds
Mhm.
with them.
There are a couple of species. There's some current research using some form of parrot and perhaps mockingbirds, where you're looking at whether the mechanisms for complex vocalization are related to the ability to discern pitches in different levels. So they're also looking at sea lions, because they do complex vocalization too. And there's a question of whether the ability to do complex vocalization is related to the idea of being able to discern, and mockingbird and parrots, or some versions of it anyway, are examples of other animals that can do complex vocalizations and can perhaps be taught to discern or recognize the same intervals or melody at different levels. So again, that's an area where we kind of developed an ability that doesn't exist amongst most of the animal kingdom. Another thing is a rhythm. We are very adept at rhythm. And you would think that's kind of a basic thing, also. Not necessarily so. One of the things we find with humans and rhythm is that we can really, if it's auditory, we're very good at keeping time. And there are several characteristics of the way that we keep time. One of them is that if there's like a metronome and we're clicking with the metronome, we're slightly ahead. We slightly anticipate what's going to happen. And if you skip a beat, if you syncopate the beat, we still know that beat's there. And we still continue to keep time. That's something that's, at least to date, as far as the research is concerned, is unique to us. Other animals, they don't anticipate the metronome. They respond to the click, so they end up being a little bit late. And we're very flexible in terms of how fast. It can go really, really slow, or it can go really, really fast. We really don't care. We're going to keep up, and we're going to anticipate the beat, and we're going to fill in with the beat where it got missed. And we're going to construct it mentally and recognize the beat should have been there, nothing played. That's when my foot comes down.
William, is there, it seems like there'd be a correlation in the rhythm of our languages, because every language has its own rhythm. And I'm wondering if the neurological pieces aren't very similar, because when I'm speaking to you right now, there's a certain rhythm. I can even speed it up, but yet the rhythm of the way I speak will probably be very, very similar.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if those, if it's the same tracks in the brain or not.
Leonard Bernstein, back in the 70s, proposed that the processing of music has something to do with verbal processing. And at the time, a lot of researchers were just very skeptical of that. There were a lot of examples of people who had neurological damage, and that verbally they were intact, they couldn't do anything with music, or musically they were intact, they had no verbiage. And so just a lot of researchers were very skeptical of it, but with recent, emerging neural imaging technology, we're able to see that indeed there is a link between verbal processing and musical processing. And so Bernstein wasn't very far off in his speculation. Yes, sir.
I like Mel Phillips. He doesn't stutter when he sings.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and there's some research like in music psychology where they're doing music therapy, where they're doing therapy with people who have stroke victims who lost their speaking ability, but they can still sing.
Yeah.
So what they do is they nurture the singing, and they train them in singing the expressions that they have in their mind, and then gradually constraining the lyric or the melodic content until the singing sounds more like speaking. And actually, so essentially what they end up doing is nurturing parts of the brain that would have been involved in the singing and making them take over more of the speaking. So again, so how can cognitive neuroscience aid us as songwriters? You know, we kind of intuitively understand that our brains kind of produce what we do. We think about things and we do things and we have ideas, we try to express those ideas. But the other side of that is what we do changes our brain. What we do changes our brain. That's an idea of neuroplasticity. And the idea that your activities cause structures in your brain, things from your environment, things you operate on out in the world, influence structures of your brain. So, you know, one example of that is they looked at violinists and compared them to non-musicians. Again, through brain imaging types of technology. They basically stimulate their left hand. Let me do this right. They change the bowing hand to right hand. Right-handed, they finger left-handed, right?
Mm-hmm.
They stimulate their right hand, and they look at the activation. Right? And they stimulate the right hand of a non-musician. Look at the activation. About the same. Stimulate their left hand, look at the activation. Stimulate the left hand of a non-musician, and you get a big difference. The activation from the stimulation, the activation of the brain from the stimulation of a violinist creates a lot more activity for a violinist than for a non-musician. And even further, the activation of their fifth finger creates a lot more activation than the activation of, say, their thumb. The thumb's not really involved in that much activity. The fifth finger gets a lot more cognitive real estate. So when you stimulate the fifth finger, you get a lot more activation compared to a non-musician. And what should have to do with us? When we think about how to get better as a songwriter, one of the things we're going to do, write a lot, listen a lot, right? Just keep writing a lot of songs, keep listening to a lot of songs. And that's good advice. What I'm hoping to find in the cognitive neuroscience research is what are the specific aspects of that generates our movement forward. And one of the things that we can probably leverage from those activities is our access to the emotionality associated with either our communication efforts when we write or in our perceptual efforts when we listen to the music of other people and trying to understand the emotions, the structure, the craftsmanship of others. And you kind of look at the benefits of that. There's this adage that for anyone to become kind of an expert in anything, you have to put in like 10,000 hours of practice. But practice what? Practice what? And the people that are involved in practicing and getting better at things, they're not just accumulating hours. They are trying to figure out how do I get from point A to point B. That takes time, but they are very deliberate in what they're doing. And sometimes the activities and the advice that we get as far as developing as songwriters doesn't necessarily allow us to be as deliberate. So there's a possibility that in some things we may be spinning our wheels a little bit, and we may be avoiding or missing out on some opportunities to move forward because of a narrow focus on some other opportunity that really we can kind of constrain ourselves to some smaller aspect of it that will benefit us more. And I think that a lot of that opportunity lies in this access to emotionality. There was a study that was done, I don't know, with the researchers. What they did, they took monkeys, right? And like this Y-shaped maze. And speaker here, and I used to put the monkey in around here. And this speaker played music, and this one was just, let me just kind of ambient noise. And they looked to see, where the monkey wants to be. And it turns out that the monkey preferred to not be where the music was. Didn't like the music.
First, what kind of music was it?
And that ends up being a question, right? What kind of music? They did another similar study with chimpanzees. And they didn't use Western music. They used a form of African native music, Indian raga, and a kind of a Japanese native music. And for chimpanzees, they tended to prefer to move towards the African and Indian music. They moved away from the Japanese music. So the type of music matters. They used cotton-top tamarins in the first study that I mentioned. So another researcher went back to cotton-top tamarins, and what they did, working in conjunction with a composer and cellist, they looked at the emotional vocal sounds of the monkeys, listened to them, dissected them, and they created music that emulated the character of these emotional vocal sounds. Sounds that indicated, grazing or finding of food, or sounds that indicated alarm that was a predator, or sounds that indicated, grooming. Different sounds. They composed music that reflect the contours of those sounds, and look at the responses of the monkeys. Now, these are the same monkeys who said, I'd rather be quiet than listen to that Bach or Beethoven. But when they had the opportunity to listen to music that was built around their own emotional vocalizations, they had a preference for that music. Now, what does that say to us as songwriters? That you kind of have to think about the backgrounds and preferences of the audience with regard to emotionality. Egocentrism won't work very well in a songwriting context. I may be reaching a bit, but the idea that, this kind of primary is a bit of a distance from us. It wasn't that they didn't like the song, or they didn't like the music. The music didn't resonate with them. It had no reflection in their own emotional world. Once the music has some reflection in their own emotional world, it's like, give me some of that.
Or could it have created an emotional response, as in fear or discomfort, and that's why they moved away from it. Could have created something.
Very. So that's attend to structure. We always get the advice that structure matters. It's important to have some control over music structure, and that has an impact on your audience's perception of the music that you write. And intuitively that makes sense. And one of the things that there's a song that plays on the radio now. I cannot remember the name of the song. It's pretty repetitive. But at the very last verse of the song, they use what in this area of psychology they call the deceptive cadence. So you're expecting, the repetition has caused you to expect, say, for the thing to go back to the home chord, to the one chord. But instead, something else is substituted, like the minor sixth chord or third. But something else ends up in that place and kind of violates that expectation that you have. That combined with this, and that ends up being pleasure. There's also research around music that gives people kind of chills. That's one of the kind of most typical explanations that people give or describe for music they really like. So it kind of gives me the chills. Like for me. Hopefully so. I don't care how many times I hear it, I still dig it. And what it is, even when we talked about those early kind of ancient systems in our brains that gotta get hooked up into our reward systems. In the music that give people the chills, or in the music that has a kind of violations of expectation, you know, again, in an ancient time, our survival depended on us being able to pick out times when something changed in the environment, when the environment stopped being stable. Things are kind of going along, and then something changed. We orient to that and decide if that was something we needed to respond to. And it was quite a relief when it wasn't something that we needed to respond to. We could just kind of go ahead and attend to what we were doing. But that reflex, that's adaptive, right? And anything that's associated with your survival value, which a reflex like that would be, gets kind of hooked up into those reward systems, those dopamine channels. So now we listen to some music, and there's this violation of expectations, something kind of a sconce about it, not too much, but enough that it kind of gets our attention. And the first part is the alarm centers of our brain that says hey, something's up. And then the secondary response of it's okay. And even though we know the piece of music, that initial alarm phase, that initial alarm perception, is so implicitly grounded into who we are. We can listen to it over and over and over. We can't stop that reflex. When that little bit of something happens, we get the ping, and then we get the secondary release of not what we do. You know, we don't articulate it that way, but that's kind of a two-phase process that they believe is going on. So when you conform to a particular structure, and people kind of grow up understanding what these things are, and then you put a little bit of a twist on it, you orient their attention, and then you bring them back to the normal, and they feel awfully good. You hit those spots in their ancient neurology, cause a little bitty orgasms.
It's called tension and release.
Yeah.
Tension and release.
And that's another aspect of attention and release. And in our culture, we do that many times with, again, deceptive cadence and things of that sort. Other cultures, they don't necessarily have a great deal of harmony in their music, but maybe they have rhythmic things that they use to create that same sense of build, tension, release, and using different mechanisms. Yes, that's a big aspect of it. Again, that idea of orienting to something and discovering that no big deal, and being able to return back to a sense of normalcy. And again, the idea is that that's just kind of ingrained deep into our nature, and things that cause that process we find pleasurable because they cause us to engage processes that we're responsible for us being able to survive. And nature does that to us. Nature biases us toward things that are related to our survival by giving us pleasure for doing those things. And so when we tweak those things in our writing, people get those sensations. I mean, they don't articulate that, they feel it. And they're kind of just frustrated. I don't have time to hear you.
You're doing good at time. This is
We
fascinating.
don't care, keep going.
Yes, it is. Fascinating.
And kind of again looking at this idea of emotion and the relationship between emotional process or verbal processing and music processing. There was a study where they took some new kids, and for a year they had the kids study piano. Piano lessons two or three times a week. Another little kids, they had them study drama, getting drama classes for a period of time. Another set of kids, nothing in particular. After a year, they looked at their ability to perceive emotion in spoken language. Now, the kids that had been taught drama, given drama lessons, they were explicitly taught about emotion and language, right? That's what drama is. It's about emotion and language. Kids in music, they taught piano. At the end of the year, the kids that had learned piano were better at discerning emotion from spoken word from language than the kids who had explicitly been taught about emotion and language. And both were better than kids who had received no training whatsoever along those lines. And again, it's getting back to that idea that language and music have this really kind of entangled relationship. So I talked about the musical preference in primaries. Prosody is one of the things we're always talking about in regard to. You've got sad lyric, and you've got sad music. You know, it's interesting. I was listening to radio this morning, and they were talking about, this guy has a book where he asked different popular artists what their favorite song is. So the interviewer asked them, what was their favorite song? It was A Day in the, was it the Beatles song, A Day in the Life?
Yeah, they are.
And it was suicide at the beginning, and then kind of mundane shaping and stuff. The music changes for those two scenes, doesn't it? Right? I mean, for the part that's got the suicide, it's not the peppy music that Paul McCartney has where he's shaving and washing his face. It's different. The music kind of goes along with the imagery and the sentiment of the part of the song that it coincides with. Prosody, in the sense that we usually talk about, is again that having music kind of mirror the imagery and the sentiments that you're trying to express with the lyrics of the song. From the standpoint of this research, they talk about prosody in spoken language as being those characteristics or elements of language that allow us to understand how the speaker feels. So the speed, the tone, high or falling, the loudness and softness of the speech. Just a whole complex of vocal things that we can hear and understand from the spoken language, the emotional state of the speaker. The things that you can gather from the phone. You can speak to somebody on the phone and you can discern whether they're happy or upset or whatever the case may be. And those are the types of things they talk about in terms of prosody. And they say that music, when we talk about the primates and taking the emotional vocalizations that they emitted and constructing music around those. The music that we have that we're familiar with tends to be reminiscent of verbal prosody. It has many of the same elements as verbal prosody. And with verbal prosody, you're able to communicate the small set of kind of primary basic emotions, anger, fear, sadness, and just a whole host of equal things that cut across cultures. You don't learn, and there are analogies to them in animals. You look at an animal, many animals, and you can look at their facial expressions and understand if they're mad or sad or fearful, whatever the case may be. Prosody is like that for us too. It cuts across cultures, and babies can go to sleep and lullaby from this culture, that culture, and that culture. They don't really care because the prosody of it is the same no matter what
What's the
culture.
word you're using?
Prosody, prosody.
Thank you.
And again, from a verbal standpoint, it is those aspects of verbal communication that allow us to understand the emotional state of the listener. And the point is that music leverages those same characteristics. It's high pitched, low, and the emotional, what music is able to do is it transcends the language to a certain degree. With vocal prosody, you're really kind of stuck with those basic emotions. With music prosody, you can take those elements and shade them. You know, there's a shading of anger, shadings of sadness. You can ramp up, and you can mix different basic emotions together to form something that's more like a complex emotion. And in vocalization, to express a complex emotion, you have to talk about it. You have to assign some words and imagery and really be specific about what's going on. With music, you don't have to do that. You can't be as specific, but you can go far beyond the vocal prosody that we associate with emotion. And it's kind of like when you look at an abstract painting or various works of art that are not photographs. What artists are able to do is take the aspects of reality that are actually pinning the emotion, that are actually important, and accentuate them. Music is kind of like that as well. And some people refer to it as kind of a super stimulus. If you think about the range of prosody in spoken word, it can only be so fast, and a person's voice only goes so high or so low. Instruments far transcend that. So the potential for the type of emotion that they can elicit from a person far exceeds the kind of spoken word. And so and when you can enrich or intensify the stimulus, you can get a heightened emotional response. So part of our task as songwriters to identify the elements of the music and the lyric. I might recommend speaking your lyric to see, kind of what is being conveyed and how do you speak it in a way that conveys some of the emotionality that you want, and how do you accentuate that? How do you find the important parts of the music to further push that along and to add the subtlety to it? And I mean, there's other things like contextual associations. We hear music in a certain place, and that kind of sticks with us. And when we hear those types of things again, it kind of takes us back. And episodic memory, things that occurred that accompanied parts of our biography. We felt a certain way about it. We hear the music and it takes us back. And then we always hear the advice about visual imagery. Again, that visual image is a way of accessing emotion. And then the final one is this idea of aesthetic response. And sometimes we respond with emotionality to something because we just recognize how great it is. We just recognize what had to go into it, what it had to mean, and just from that recognition, from an aesthetic standpoint, we can be emotional about it. I finally reached a conclusion. I think in the last presentation there was somebody that said something about, I just want to write songs. I don't need to know all that. I don't want to demystify it. I don't want to know all that stuff about it. I think knowing more about how your brain processes and perceives music can inform our activities and attention as we endeavor to get better at songwriting. When I think back at Leonard Bernstein and what he was saying, I think music's got something to do with verbal processing. And this is after years and years of experience and accumulation of professional judgment. Something is professional judgment kind of saying, I think this has something to do with verbal processing. Do you doubt that insight found its way into the music anymore?
Absolutely.
I'm sure that insight, that perception, that idea, even though the research community kind of, I don't think so. My experience says this has got something to do with verbal processing. And I think that found its way into his music. And I think that what science can offer us is, there's probably no substitute for that professional judgment, but you can get to certain things more quickly. Like that observation, verbal processing and music processing have things in common. That's a starting place. You can take that as something to work with. It doesn't make you Leonard Bernstein, But, you know, you don't have to go 30, 40 years to come to that insight either. And like anything, deliberate practice is the holy grail of learning. And we talked about the 10,000 hours. And the idea is, you know, you want to be engaged in activities that move our abilities forward. And we don't want to spin our wheels at things that really are just that kind of spinning the wheels. And the more you can identify the characteristics of activities that make those incremental improvements in what you're doing, the better off you are. And it turns out that it's not just one thing. There was a book that I was reading about practicing, just practicing in general. And it's like, you know, most accomplished musicians that this cognitive psychologist interviewed, they, in the narrow definition of practice, don't practice. They do a whole bunch of other things that help them move forward. You know, they go and they watch other people play. You know, there's something called mirror neurons. And when you're listening to music or when you're watching other people play music, when you're listening to rhythms, those things ping physical responses, even if you're not actively moving around or doing anything, they ping the physical reference of what you're hearing. So when you're trying to produce those things, those same pathways are being engaged.
Is it like muscle memory?
It's like muscle memory.
Muscle memory? Except it's neurological.
As an analogy, it works that way. The physiology of it is different. It has to do with neural connections and neural pathways. But it's kind of the same idea. The more you use something, the more you engage something, the more you potentiate it, the more available you make it to yourself. And by listening to music, by thinking very deliberately and intently about the various elements of music, and being very conscious about what you're listening for, you start to potentiate those things for yourself. And when you try to go in the other direction, you have more of a resource available to you. And again, the more you practice it, the more you work on it, the more you make that available to you. As a final thing I'll mention, a study where they looked at kids that had been studying piano compared to kids that had not been studying piano. And one of the things that they found was that for the ones that had been studying piano, the bundle of nerves and neurons that connect two sides of the brain were larger.
So they can switch more.
They had a richer communication network between the left and right side of the brain compared to a non-practicing control group. And, well, that's what I'm talking about. We always hear of kind of language being a left hemisphere thing, music being a right hemisphere thing. Again, research has indicated that's not true. There's a bias towards the right side or the left side. In language, if you think about language, the beats of language and tonal differences in language go by really, really quickly, and there's a lot of it in a very short period of time. So there's a premium placed on being able to process that rhythm and process those pitch differences really quickly. Not with a great deal of precision, but really quickly. Music is just the opposite. The rhythms and the changes in pitch go by relatively slowly, right? Go by relatively slowly. They need to be mapped onto some sort of a spatial representation for the notes and the intervals between the notes. So it's a slower processing of information. They leverage much of the same resource, except that there's been kind of a specialization of that fast processing of language to the left side and the slower processing of the music to the right side. But all that mapping and understanding, that's kind of spread between the two. So again, when you get the kids that have been studying, what gets enhanced is the linkage between the two. Because what reading is a spatial task, right? The coordination of the hands, all that reaching type activity, that's on the right side, right? Along with the music of it. But the idea is if there's a biasing towards right or left, but really it's very, very integrated because and with the earlier stuff about people who lose language and still have their musicality, but lost their language. What it is they both use a lot of the same mechanisms and capacities, but they have their own domain-specific information as well. And you can disrupt the domain-specific stuff, but leave those basic competencies still intact. So you can get one that doesn't work and the other does work because its domain-specific capacity is still intact and it's still pulling from those common resources. The end.